This is the Inner Chief Podcast, episode 380.
And so that means that if someone is going through this and they're trying to fake and amplify multiple aspects of their personality, they might actually overfit for a particular job. And what I mean by that is when we match someone to a job, we use a bit of a Goldilocks scale. And that means that, just like with Goldilocks, the porridge can be too cold, too hot, or just right? There's a sweet spot somewhere on that continuum. We have these sweet spots across all of our different areas of personality. So someone who's really ramping up and saying, yes, they're very assertive, might actually come out as being too assertive for a specific role.
G'day, this is the Inner Chief Podcast, episode 380 with Justin McNamara, Psychometrics Guru, on improving recruitment selection, performance prediction, and acing psychometric tests. I am your host, Greg Layton, founder of Chiefmaker and the Council of Chiefs. I believe there is a great chief in all of us, and that through listening to the stories, strategies, and techniques of great CEOs and gurus, each of you can find and leave your own legacy through your work and life. The Inner Chief Podcast is where you will learn how to think and make moves like a CEO, like a true chief. For over a decade, I've helped CEOs and senior executives around the world boldly lead change, inspire their people, and leave a legacy. On the Inner Chief Podcast, I bring these stories to life with deep diving CEO interviews, interspersed with minisodes covering key leadership challenges, so you will find your own path to greatness as an executive. In this special episode, our first for 2026, we replay a chat I had with Justin McNamara. Justin is an occupational psychologist who loves working at the intersection of people and data in order to support companies to solve tricky problems. During his career, he has been privileged to learn from great minds at the University of Queensland and both Kent and Cambridge universities in the UK, while happily immersing himself in the latest research. His passion for psychometrics, machine learning and data have resulted in deep expertise in the creation of custom assessment solutions for a variety of businesses in most industries to improve the performance of their people and selection process. In his own words, he loves bringing the nerdier things to life for clients in a pragmatic and business-focused way. In this Best of Masterclass, Justin will share what psychometrics are and aren't, and which ones are useful in the recruitment process. We'll talk about knowing the markers for success for predicting both performance and leadership, the future of psychometrics and big data, and the key factors in ensuring you can ace a psychometric test. Chiefs, without further ado, let's kick off the new year with Justin McNamara. Well, it's a pleasure to be joined by my old mate, Justin McNamara, Psychometrics Guru. Justin, welcome to the show, mate.
Thank you very much for having me.
Listen, I know you very well. We've been friends for, I think, about 20 years, but no one else does. So can you tell us a story that sums up your childhood and early life?
Sure can. So my dad, and all of us moved around a little bit because he was in the army. So one of my earliest memories is actually in a butcher's shop in Quetta in Pakistan. And we're in there is actually my mum and I, and the butcher was obviously trying to, entertain me or show me something interesting, and pointed to underneath the counter, where to my disgust, there was a complete cow's skull just hanging out there on display. And I think I squealed in panic. And I think you know me well enough that it just takes a cow skull these days to make me squeal again. But I think the wider picture there is probably a bit of freedom to explore, really, and almost an expectation. So in my childhood, there's lots of times playing outside, but it really was go and make your own adventures. Go on the bikes with your friends, go play cricket or soccer or something in the backyard, kick the football around. But we'll see you at next mealtime. The expectation is you've got full autonomy to get out there, go entertain yourself, go explore, and have fun in the process. So lots of happy memories, I suppose, of doing my own thing with friends and learning about life as I went along.
Well, I've got a next question I ask just about everyone, which is, what was your first car? That, given you and I have a bit of a shared history, I can tell you who your, well, probably not your first chauffeur was, but I know who one of your next one was, and that was me. But what was your first car in the end? What did you end up coming down with?
We actually had a Toyota Corolla, actually, sold in burgundy red. As you know, I love my wine, so the fact it was branded burgundy, I was sold by that. But yes, man, you're right. I didn't get that one until I think early 20s, and so I spent a lot of my misspent youth in your 1986 white Mitsubishi Magna, or I should say, your mother's.
My mother, the sea Magna, that got us around to university and all the good things there was to do in those early days. Now, so is your primary criteria for car selection now, is the colour based on a wine variety? So Shark or Burgundy, Shiraz.
Yes, I wish I had that sort of flippant discretion when it came to cars, but no, it's purely practical with two little ones. We need something with a big boot and space for a couple of car seats in the back. So no, practicalities take over desirable aesthetic qualities.
I think this is actually a very important segue, because you are a very practical guy, and you're now in this world of psychometric testing. You're an expert in that and the machine learning and things like this, which in the practicality stakes puts you a little bit further along the journey than I am. But I'd like to know a bit more about how you got into psychometric testing. And I'll give people a bit of a background. So you and I, we went to university together in the very early days. We were in a business course together. We did our undergrad work together. We were in a course called EC 134, which was macroeconomics. And I managed to get a conceited pass, and you didn't, right? So you failed stats basically in the early days, but now you're an absolute guru in it. So what changed, and what has led you to this life in psychometrics? And just tell us a bit about that and why it's so fascinating to you.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think with stats and even maths at high school, I got it, right? So it wasn't that I struggled to get the concepts. I just saw no reason that I would ever need to know this in my life. I remember doing advanced maths at high school, whatever it was, Maths 2 or Maths C, whatever it was at the time. And the only practicality I think I got out of that was that an object will reach maximum distance at 45 degrees. And I thought, finally, I can kick a football further if I kick it at 45 degrees. That is the only practical thing I've taken from all these years of hardship. But actually, my very first job as a psych at Queensland Rail, we had some expensive software there that used to analyze the fatigue risk for train drivers. So you imagine, the number of shifts they do in a row, whether the shifts are during the day or at night, how long the shift is, those sorts of things. And that would predict how likely there could be a fatigue-related incident, right? Or the probability there could be risk related to that. And so I had some data on that. And then I had some data on SPADs, or signals passed at danger, which is basically when a train runs a red light. But obviously that's a big deal. It's trains are very heavy and they're hard to stop, and you've got huge, financial and personal risk associated. And basically, I did some basic stats and showed there was no relationship, between the outputs from this fancy software that we were paying, tens of thousands of dollars for a year, and this, number one risk for us in the business. Now, that got a lot of interest in the business, and suddenly, obviously it played to my ego that the people were interested in some of the work I'd done, but suddenly I saw some real world application and a real world outcome. So that was part of the attraction for me. And I guess probably another story that sort of sums up that attraction was how important it is to get the right people in the door in the first place. So I was doing some work in the UK, which, as I spent a big chunk of my career in. We were trying to do cultural trains again in the railways. We had to go into parts of the business, had 16 weeks to produce a 50% productivity improvement. And then 12 months later, that part of the business had to have another 50% productivity improvement. So that change had to be baked in, had to be embedded. And a lot of the challenges were cultural. They were baked into the people who maybe had lost their passion for the job, maybe who weren't best suited to that job anymore, or maybe they realized that they weren't moving forward in their career and they weren't as motivated as they used to be. And so it really drove home for me that when we're inviting people to join these businesses, we need to make sure they're the right fit in the first place. So I guess those are sort of two light bulb moments, if you will. And I guess on that tangent, my career was largely in in-house companies, really big companies who could have an in-house site. There was a time in the UK when my contract was coming to an end where I had the choice, if you like, to do another in-house large sort of psyche role. And I knew what that was like. The challenge wasn't quite the same for me. But in that last role, I was dealing with a lot of consultancies. And I thought that some of the quality of the work that was being produced didn't match what was being charged. So it's a moment of backing myself, sort of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I often think about that Robert Frost's poem, two roads diverged in the wood and I took the one less traveled by. And that was one of those little arcs in my career journey where I backed myself and started specializing heavily in psychometrics because I just really loved that space. And that's made all the difference since I took that fork in the road.
Tell us about psychometrics. I would say just about everyone who's a listener has come across a psychometric in one form or another. I'd like to know a bit more about them. What are the different types? So I'd like to start with that first. What are the different types of psychometric tests so people know what we're talking about here?
Yeah, sure thing. And I guess, even taking a step further back, what are psychometrics? And, all this stuff goes back, I think, to the Greek goddess Psyche and things like that. But we just think about them as measures of the mind. And so the most common measures that people come across would be ability or aptitude tests. So it's very common when people are applying for jobs, they might do a verbal reasoning or numerical reasoning test, and these are actually solving problems to do with words or problems to do with numbers. So they're very common ability tests. We've got personality measures, which really look at people's preferred way to think, feel, and behave at work. People in the workforce would probably also come across surveys. So culture or engagement surveys would also sort of fall under this. And then when we think back to school, or those of us with kids at school, in the UK, they have GCSEs or A levels. And, over in Australia, we've got things like NAPLAN. All of those things would fall under the banner of psychometrics.
As you say, it's a measure of the mind. So measuring the capability of the mind or cognitive function of the mind, the behavioral traits, and anything else. I suppose that fits underneath the psychometric banner. So what is the reputation of psychometrics? And I've got a reason for asking this because a lot of people would come across them in very different contexts, maybe at times feel like they didn't get the information they wanted. Maybe they felt like the tests didn't portray them in the way they wanted to be portrayed. What is the reputation of them?
I think it's incredibly mixed. I think if you just put in psychometric tests on, into Google, you'll start to see why, because there's a lot of dodgy tests out there. There's, people who think they can create them themselves, first go through sort of a rigorous scientific process to create them. And there's some very popular tests that are still used today that haven't adapted as the science has changed over time. And so basically you've got maybe some tests that are good for development or coaching or a team session being used in sort of more high stakes situations, such as, whether someone should get a job or whether someone should be promoted. And that's just not a good practice. That doesn't reflect how tests should be used. And as you've mentioned, there's also poor candidate experience, so there might be there are lots of tests. We talked about ability tests before that are heavily speeded. That's where there's a time constraint. You've only got a few seconds to respond. And that can be quite challenging and disheartening for people who don't feel they get to show themselves at their best. Or alternatively, people spend, an hour or a couple of hours doing these tests and they never get feedback. They weren't successful in their application and they don't get a feedback report. They don't get any insight into their personality or their response to these particular assessments. And so it's a very negative experience for them. So I think that's some of the negatives, if you will. I mean, I think on the flip side, better psychometrics, modern psychometrics have a lot of very strong science behind them. A very easy example of that, if we think about those ability tests that we talked about before, there's over 100 years of data now about those predicting job performance. You know, some amazing stuff going all the way back to World War One, where the army were testing, I think, about 2 million people for who were coming into the army to work out which role they might be best suited to and how they could best support their capabilities, could best support that army perform at their best. So some amazing science around predicting job performance. Also, the cost, so the potential return on investment is phenomenal. If you're using thousands of these tests, you might be getting them for, $10 or $20 a pop. And you think about, that you could explain potentially if it's a complex white collar role, maybe 50% of how well someone's going to perform for the cost of 10 or 20 bucks. That's remarkable. And the fact we can deliver these now to the comfort in your own home, right? You can use pretty much any web browser, generally any sort of large tablet or tablet device will host them well and seamlessly. So people could be doing them 24/7. It's quite remarkable from a technology and scientific point of view, what we can do and the value that can add to a business.
Chief, one of the core skills of all great chiefs is the ability to interview and recruit the very best performers to your team. Now, many chiefs say to me that they get up to 25 or even 40% of their recruitment decisions wrong. Now, many of you who listen to this show will know that over the last 6 years, we have asked dozens of CEOs what is their number one interview question when recruiting for senior roles. What we have done is turn that into an invaluable resource. It is the 30 most powerful interview questions used by CEOs to hire high performers. These are the questions that reveal the true nature of the person in front of you. They are the ones that give or create that truth-telling moment that will help you decide whether to hire or not. Chief, if you want this resource, just go to chiefmaker.com/interview and just pop in your details and download the detailed PDF. I'd like to look at this from two different lenses. Let's talk initially about how to use psychometrics when we're recruiting other people, and then let's look about how to perform best when you're being asked to complete a test. That way we can look at how to improve your performance in your current role. And if you're going for another role, we'll talk about how people can ace those tests within a bit more depth. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So in recruiting others, first question is, should we be using tests at all? I think you've sort of just answered that, right?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, they add a lot of value, but I think the question before, should we be using tests or any technique, right, in recruitment is, what does good look like in this job? So those of us in the trade talk about doing a job analysis, which is basically understanding what good or great performance looks like in this current job, and then also thinking ahead into a reasonable time frame, and that might be the next 6 months in this job or industry, or maybe the next 2 to 3 years. What's going to be expected of people in this type of role in the foreseeable future? Now, once you understand what good performance looks like, you can start thinking about, okay, what are the markers? What are the drivers of that good performance? And then what are the best way to get evidence of those markers, right? To surface those types of behaviors. And sometimes that's testing, right? And for lots of sort of white collar professional style of roles, psychometric tests add a huge amount of value. But, I can think about to my early days, where I was working through university, where I was in hospitality. They did basically a work sample, which is basically you go in and you do a 1 or 2 hour shift and you do a sample of the job, right? Those things are fantastic, fairly low cost, but you're doing an exact snippet of the job. So, it should be a very good predictor, and research shows it is, of how you'll perform in the job as well.
I just want to go back to that term you used there before about the markers that would define success. Can you give us some examples of markers for perhaps a more senior role?
Yeah, sure thing. So basically what we're looking for are key things that we can measure that should separate higher from lower performance. And so one of those markers for a more senior role might be around the ability to flex their influencing style and do more of a push, right? So that's a bit more of an assertive style of influencing, where they can drive home and look to push for a good, say, commercial outcome, if you will. And then there might be that flex where they can do a bit more pull of that influencing. And you can imagine that style. Let's say they're trying to motivate or coach one of their direct reports. So they're trying to draw out what's motivating and important to that team member or direct report. So it's a very different influencing style. So in a sense, that marker, those behaviors we'd look for, and that could be recruitment or it could be, an assessment or development center with senior people who spend a bit more time. Having that ability to flex or seeing evidence of both of those complementary styles would be a marker of higher potential for leadership success. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So what you do is when you create you do the job analysis and what does good look like, you're creating a list of those potential behaviors that you need to see plus cognitive ability. So you're really clear on the kind of individual you want. And I suppose any reverse engineer the testing to get you that individual. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I understand what good looks like, right? So in a sense, you've got your recipe and then work out backwards, the methods or the ingredients that are going to deliver that recipe for you.
Okay, so what are the different ways we can use to test in recruitment? So you spoke about like a real test and there's also a resume and an interview, but what are the other options? Actually, let's start with number one, because most people only use a resume and an interview. Is that right?
Yes.
So is that a reasonable thing to do? Is that cost you big time? Well, tell me, what do you think about that?
Generally, it's not great. And, there's a few reasons around that. So resumes generally don't actually have that much useful information for us, right? And generally, that's a range of different factors. One, we know that we might jazz up our resumes to sort of, overplay what we've done in previous rows. So there's a bit of...
Surely not. No one's it. Yeah.
Exactly right. Questionable integrity around that. Also, some of the assumptions we make around the data we get from resumes can be a bit faulty. So, one of the things that might be useful, we think is, okay, well, how much years experience does this person have doing a similar type of job? We think that's quite reasonable, but the research shows that the relationship between number of years experience and job performance is actually weak. Right? It's less than half as good, if you like, than, say, using an ability test. And the reason for that is the relationship, one, isn't what we say linear. So basically, more isn't better. So basically, the research shows that it seems to cap out after about 5 years. And also, you can think that experience can actually be quite varied based on the role that you're in and your motivations to perform. So, I think back to once again my early days in hospitality. I was working behind the bar at the now closed Michael's restaurant in Brisbane. It was quite the establishment to go to, and so I was the cocktail barman there. But I actually had quite a small range of cocktails that I was asked to make. So some mojitos and Manhattans and martinis and those sorts of things. But there was actually probably only 5 to 10 that I was regularly making. So even though I had several years experience, if you were to then move me to, the mixologist role of today, right, in a happening bar or Sydney or Melbourne where they might be competent on 50 to 100 cocktails, actually my year's experience would be a very poor predictor of actually my performance in that type of role. So it's one of those things where we think we're getting a good signal, but actually we're not. We're getting a weak signal. Another thing around, sort of resumes is the bias that unfortunately gets baked in. And there's some, very damning research now that, if you have sort of more Western recruiters, if you will, and you give them the same CV, one that's, everything is identical except it's a Western name versus, say, a non-Western name, then those candidates with the Western name will get more interviews. Now, I'm not sure if that research has been replicated where you have the non-Western recruiters, biasing the non-Western names. It could well be, but that's clear, right, that bias is there. And then also, recruiters will sometimes think they found a valid signal, a valid hack to look for potential. And I was reading an article the other day from some of the recruiters at Netflix, and they were talking about they were hiring for these really technical roles. So they couldn't really judge, right, the technical quality before a technical interview was done. So they thought they were very happy. They found this signal, they thought, where some of their best coders also were into music. So they talked about the sort of joy where a recruiter would say, oh, look, I found someone who is, a virtuoso on the piano. We're definitely going to interview them. And actually, that's a case of, a really clear human bias coming into the process where we think we've found a good signal, but actually it's, humans just aren't that good at processing lots of data and objectively working out what's the wheat and what's the chaff.
So other issues would be like things like you see a particular company that has a good reputation, and then you assume that they're going to be good because of that.
Bang on. Yeah. Excellent example. So the interview itself, generally people will favor what's called an unstructured interview. And so that's where they'll sort of tailor the questions to the person they see in front of them. They'll maybe use their interview as the guides. They'll sort of follow the conversation. If they build a good rapport, they'll sort of follow that line. And so unstructured interviews, when we look at the data, are really good, right? And so they can be as bad as basically flipping a coin to predicting job performance. So they're not great, right? And once again, we get into a lot of trouble when it comes to bias. Generally people are more favorable to people who have a similar background to themselves. So they're less good. I mean, what is better is what we call structured interviews, right? And structure comes from having the same headline questions for each person that we're interviewing, and then having some sort of structured scoring process, right? And that could be exactly what we talked about before from the job analysis. Those key sorts of ingredients that we're looking for, we might look for evidence of those coming through in people's responses to those headline questions that we're asking them. So using a structured interview is actually highly predictive of how well will perform people will generally perform in role. Is an excellent technique to use in our recruitment process.
Okay, so what are the other options outside of resume and interview in order to determine if a candidate is going to be the right fit?
Well, there are lots out there, right? I'd probably start off with some sort of screening criteria. So we sometimes call these killer questions in the trade. So these are your non-negotiables. So they might be, certain degrees, a driver's license, willingness to relocate or work in a specific location, right to work or have certain clearances. And these can add, tremendous value. Probably an extreme example that comes to mind is we had a question for a major supermarket in the UK. They had pharmacists in some of their stores, and the question, are you a qualified pharmacist, got rid of about 75% of candidates. So, remarkable value for, what you'd assume would be a key criteria for that type of role. So, yes, getting some sort of screening questions up front is great. Then I'd favor using psychometrics. Structured interview, as I talked about, adds tremendous value. And then, some companies will add a second stage interview. But I really like using some sort of work sample as well. And we touched upon a work sample before, where I was doing that hospitality trial. But this can be, simplified for most roles where it's just a little snippet of a key task they might need to do as well. So that might be, you can imagine someone's going for a marketing role. They might be giving some materials and they come in and they do a marketing brief, right? How they'd approach the strategy or that particular campaign. Maybe the role's a bit more analytical, right? So we give them a bit of data to look at, and then we get them to do a presentation. I remember doing some more in-depth simulations for senior managers, and we gave them a couple of hours actually to look over some acquisition options, did a formal presentation on what their acquisition strategy would be and why. So those sort of work samples don't need to be over-engineered, but they can be a beautiful buy to those people at maybe your final three candidates, if you will, that you're considering for a role. Does that all make sense, Greg?
Makes perfect sense. I think the key thing here is to understand, and like one of the key philosophies we've had on this show for a long time is that get the right people on the bus. If you recruit well from the very beginning, it makes things like your culture change and your transformation that much easier. So when you're going about that, make sure you have a rounded set of techniques and approaches in order to test and ensure you're improving your chances of engaging the right candidate. Because we all know the costs if you get it wrong. 6, 12 months delays, potentially, costs in recruitment and training and all development. These things can actually cost in the end millions of dollars if you get it wrong, depending on the seniority of the role. So I suppose that's what it comes down to is pick the right set of activities based on the seniority or the importance of the role. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, take the step further back again, because you talk about getting the right people in the bus. So you need to know the direction of travel for the bus, right? So that's the leader's vision and the culture they're trying to create. And yeah, you bang on then get a range of techniques. I think that's a really good takeaway. So don't just rely on an interview, right? Use a range of different techniques, because each of those will give you a new bite of the cherry.
Yep.
And then make sure that those things are giving you information about the behaviors that you expect from those new team members.
Okay, let's just imagine now, well, I'm going to recruit someone to be in my team, and I've decided I've got a range of things I'm going to do, but one of them is going to be psychometric tests. How do I choose which ones to use?
Okay. So there are probably, I guess, sort of 4 main tenets that we might look for. One is how reliable that particular test is, and that's about sort of accuracy. So you imagine each morning we get into our car, we expect it to start, right? And when we're driving it, we expect it to handle in a certain way. When we turn the steering wheel a certain amount, we expect the car to turn a certain amount. And this is basically trying to get a look, if we got people to do the same test again, would they get a very similar result? So there are different markers where we use this, but your supplier, your provider of a psychometric test should be able to assure you that it's a reliable and accurate measure. So that's marker 1. Marker 2 is what we term validity, which is basically, look, does the test or the assessment measure what it claims to measure? Basically, if you're looking at this to predict a leadership outcome or predict how well someone's going to do in a particular professional job, then you should look for evidence that test or that measure can actually do that. Right? It measures personality, or it measures leadership potential, or whatever the test is claiming it measures. So you should look for some sort of evidence of that. And I'd also, recommend to listeners to do what we call a local validation study, which is where you can actually trial it in your business and get evidence that it works and separates, if you like, your better performance from your lower performance. Because it gives you a lot of power then to make the test more customizable in your particular context. So that's the second of the 4 markers. The third marker.
Can you give
an
example? Just expand on that point. So can you just explain that again so I understand it? So you have a test, and maybe it's a behavioral based psychometric, and you want to test that internally for its validity. That is, will it be a reasonable predictor of success? How do I test that internally? Can you just give an example of a marker that I might want to test, and then how I would do that?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, this can be, I can give you, very simple and then very complex examples I've done in the past. So a very simple one. Let's think it's a sales role, right? Sure. So what I might have is, a large group of salespeople. Ideally we've sort of got about 100 people is our sort of ideal. And roughly, half of those are better performers and roughly half are poor performers. That's okay if we've got something in the middle. And I might give all of them the test or tests that I'm interested in. And then I might compare how they perform on the test to, let's say, their volume of sales, right, for a quarter or for a year. Right, it might be that one crude outcome metric. Now, often I encourage businesses to think a little bit broadly. So volume of sales is what we call a task outcome. So something that you're paying someone to do, a task that they're designed to deliver. But then it also might be useful to think about how they do that task, right? So you might also get a measure in there about how they are with their team members or how satisfied their customers are, right? So that could give you something else. It's also useful. And then also we think with our customers about, okay, what about counterproductive behaviors? So we might take into account, unexplained absences, sickness leave, or those sorts of markers. I remember working with a retailer in the UK and they talked about stock shrinkage, which is basically people nicking stock when they were working in a supermarket. Basically, there can be some markers in a role about, okay, when things aren't going particularly well. But, to keep it simple, it's basically, let's look at how people do in the tests and let's link it to outcomes that matter in this role for the business. And let's see, look, can the test separate people crudely into 2 groups? Can it accurately predict who are the better performers and who are the poorer performers? Does that make more sense?
Exactly. And so then you test that across your current crop of employees, and then anyone who's applying for the job also gets tested, and then you might have some evidence that this would be a reasonable predictor of performance.
Yeah, and if you've done that local validation, you might even have a benchmark, right? Because you imagine that there might be a certain threshold, right, on these psychometrics that separates people into these higher and lower performers. So then you can use that threshold in that recruitment context.
Okay, so these are behavior-based type psychometrics. Is there anything else that we should know about those if we're going to select one or use one, and any particular tricks? Because I want to talk more about cognitive ability tests quickly as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I mean, these markers we're talking about, how accurate or reliable, how valid a test is, this goes across all different types of tests, right? So be it behavioral or cognitive ability.
Okay.
We talked about the first two, reliable and valid. The next one goes sort of standardized, which is basically who you're being compared to on the test. So you imagine that, if you do an ability test, you'll get a percentile output, which is basically, look, Greg's performance on this assessment was equal to or higher than this percent of people. And so you want to know what that comparison group is. And you want to make sure that comparison group is relevant for the types of decisions you're making. So if I benchmark your level of assertiveness against the general population, right? So we take 100 people from the street, compared to them, how assertive are you? That benchmark is very different if I then compare you to executive leaders who are naturally more assertive individuals. So that benchmark would make a difference then when I'm interpreting the results from that psychometric test. So the comparison groups that people are going to use make a difference. And then finally, the fourth marker is around fairness. And that's about people from different groups perform equally well on the assessment or the test. And so, a topical one or, one that there's lots of data around is gender, right? So we'd expect generally that males and females might show some differences on different aspects of tests. Hence, when we're thinking about our recruitment process in the round, just keep in mind, every recruitment technique we use has a degree of bias. We would look for that bias to be sort of averaged out, right? So we know that people from different groups who first enter our recruitment process have an equal chance of being offered a job at the end.
Well, that's a lot to think about. Okay, I think what that certainly gives me is a clearer understanding of designing the right psychometric to get the right person in the role that fits what you're going as an organization. I think that's the key message: is use them with precision when you're going to use them. Don't just throw any old psychometric test out there, because it might just increase your bias. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to talk to that point specifically, there's a few companies I've dealt with where they're using the wrong test because, a senior leader likes that test. Maybe they've had a good experience with it.
Sure.
So that's a definite watch out, if you will, to use a test that just isn't suitable for the context. And another example, I was dealing with an investment bank, and they were finding that basically the comparison group, which was easy. And so people were doing quite well on average on this test. So they started using a very extreme pass mark. People had to get above the 85th percentile. So that's basically the performance on the test was equal to or higher than 85% of people who had done that test. So an extremely high pass mark that was leading to a lot of bias. They weren't getting much diversity through their recruitment process. Okay. So yes, being careful with the tests that you use and making sure that those tests measure what matters to you and your business and where it's going is very important.
Excellent. Right. Now let's talk about the flip side of the coin. You're not recruiting now, you're being recruited. You're sitting there, you have been said, okay, we want to test you for this role to see if you're going to be suitable. And you get a couple of different types of tests, a cognitive ability test and a personality or behavior-based test. Let's talk about cognitive ability tests first. First of all, is it the best predictor of performance? Is it a good predictor? Like if I'm doing it, okay, right. So it's important. A demo better get it right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's for the majority of, sort of white-collar professional roles, it's pretty much the best we have predicting performance. Probably the only and worthwhile exception for your listeners is when it comes to leadership, we might favor personality. Right? That's very important. But yes, cognitive ability adds a lot of value to the recruitment process.
Okay, so how do you ace a cognitive ability test, right? Because people know there's all sorts of factors which are probably going to impact their performance under pressure to complete these tests? How do you nail it?
I don't know if it's possible to always nail it, but I think the focus on how you can be at your best is probably the key aspect from this. And it starts with a good night's sleep. So there's very clear research that, our cognitive performance declines when we're sleep deprived. So a good night's sleep is really key. Then it's probably picking the window that you're going to do the test itself or tests. So a bit of self-awareness will help you here, in the sense that, we've got a small group of people who perform really well very early in the morning, and a small group who perform really well really late at night. And most of us are in the middle. So probably picking where you are performing at your best, or taking the test where you perform at your best, is very important. There's some funny little research around caffeine, and that actually found that for introverts, right, so people who are a little bit more sensitive to stimuli, they do worse on tests where they have to solve number problems when they have had a coffee. So that's probably a good little self-awareness tip for people to make sure that they understand how caffeine impacts their performance, and making sure that you're in a quiet environment. So it's quite often that I'll have candidates maybe contact me after they've done one of my tests, and they'll say, "Oh, look, I did it after a long haul flight. I was back in the office for the first time in a few days or a few weeks. People were asking me questions all the way through. I was trying to do some emails." So that's never going to put you in a peak state, right? So whether it's doing it at home, doing it when the kid's in the bed, booking a meeting room, right? You've got to be in a distraction-free environment. And probably the final thing, practice. There's a very clear practice effect on cognitive ability tests. And what's going to help you do your best is to practice questions that are most similar to the test you're going to complete. And particularly to try and practice those with some sort of time pressure. Because often the questions themselves people can solve if they had lots of time, but they're given, let's say, 30 seconds to a minute to answer these questions. And suddenly that's an added factor that throws them off their game. So I probably can't recommend that point enough, that people invest some time to practice questions that are similar to the ones they're going to do under some sort of time pressure or time constraint.
Can you give us some links to where people can do that, to go and buy some tests and practice them? We'll put them in the show notes of people, so if that comes up for them, they can go and access that resource.
Yeah, happy to do that. But I'd probably also underscore the point that, the bigger test publishers, or, the common ones, should have practice tests.
Okay.
And actually practicing those ones are really important. And the reason I stress that is, I've written a lot of tests for different test publishers, and test publishers have a house style, right? They want their test done a certain way. And so if you just practice on vanilla or general tests, you might be a little bit thrown, because you come across and this particular test is done in a different style. So yes, happy, I'll provide you some links, but would always encourage people, if they can, to try and do some practice, or at least see the style of the one that they need to complete for this job that they're interested in.
Righto, Chiefs. More from Justin in a minute. Now, recently, I spoke to Rupert Guinness, legendary sports writer, author, public speaker, and endurance cyclist. We spoke about choosing growth and opportunity at every turn, and discovering untapped physical and mental capacity through extreme adversity. Here's what Rupert had to say about his one more time philosophy.
And we'd go up these climbs, and I'd be thinking, I can't go any further, I can't. So no, just one more switchback. And I still use that memory of that today. One more, you just don't know what view is at animal. And it served me so many times. You come around and, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. I have to go and see what's around the next corner. And that takes a sense of the wonderment, the excitement of what's there.
You can listen to that wonderful chat with Rupert Guinness by going to chiefmaker.com/378. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the podcast and check out all the other great interviews with our chiefs and gurus, as well as all the minisodes by going to chiefmaker.com/listen now. Righto, Chiefs, let's get back to our Best Of series with Justin McNamara. Okay, now let's talk about more behaviour-based tests. Tell us about how you perform best in those, because I think that would be very interesting because I think sometimes you can try and fake it to maybe try and give the right answer, but does that cost you later? Like, tell us how they work and how to get the best outcome for you.
Yeah, sure thing. So from a psych angle, we always encourage people to be open and honest when they do it and to trust their first response, about how strongly they might agree with one question or, which question best defines them. Now, you're right, they can be faked and people do fake them. But the challenge is multifaceted. So one is people who will fake on those quite often won't fit the job that they're actually going for. So, if we fast forward, you've said that you enjoy a fast-paced environment and, you love responding to setbacks and all the pace and excitement that comes from that, but you're actually not one of those people. When you're in that type of job, you're likely to find it really stressful. Maybe you prefer to work in a more cautious and slow and deliberate manner. So you actually find it you have a lot of inner churn that you're being forced to make decisions with limited time, limited resources. Maybe there's a bit of fractious relationships between you and your coworkers because they keep pushing you for decisions faster than you're comfortable to make them. Alternatively, other people will see that you just don't fit in. So you might be, it might be highlighted to you that you don't fit that culture. And so you might find yourself 3 or 6 months down the track looking for another job. The other side of this is some companies, so my own, if you like, we use a profile scoring method. And so we'll score people against a exact job. And so that means that if someone is going through this and they're trying to fake and amplify multiple aspects of their personality, they might actually overfit for a particular job. And what I mean by that is when we match someone to a job, we use a bit of a Goldilocks scale. And that means that, just like with Goldilocks, the porridge can be too cold, too hot, or just right? There's a sweet spot somewhere on that continuum. We have these sweet spots across all of our different areas of personality. So someone who's really ramping up and saying, yes, they're very assertive, might actually come out as being too assertive for a specific role. So they might have overfaked. Other questionnaires out there will actually have questions in there designed to catch people out. And that might impact how that person's application is viewed on the whole. So I probably discourage people from trying to present themselves as significantly different than how they actually are in the world of work.
So just go, as you said, trust your first response and answer as honestly as you can, and it'll give the best possible outcome.
Well, I think you've got the best possible chance of that job being the right job for you.
Okay, now what happens if you bottled it? Like you get to the end of either the cognitive ability test or behavior-based test, and you think, I've just got that so wrong, and now they've got a report or a test on me, and I'm going to look bad. What do you do?
Well, if you've been open and honest with your personality responses, you can't bottle it, right? So that's probably an important point, right? If you've gone through those types of assessments and you've just given a true and honest reflection of you, then if it's the right fit, then it's meant to be. So you can let go of the anxiety around that. Bottling it for the cognitive ability is different though. And for me, one, this comes down to preparation, right? So have you done enough practice? And then two, do you have a legitimate reason that might have impacted you bottling it? And so, I gave one before where someone had, they're very dutiful. There was a deadline for do the testing. They'd been on some leave. They'd done lots of travel. They were jet lagged. They did it in the office, being distracted and multitasking with others. And they made contact and said, look, I don't think I've done my best performance. Here are the legitimate reasons why. And in that instance, we let them redo it, right? We allowed them to retest. And, test companies and individual companies will have their own policies around that. On the flip side, I had another candidate recently. They were going for an analytical role and they had their results fed back to them and they didn't perform well on the questions relating to solving problems with numbers. At that point, they claimed that there was a lot of internet dropout and that impacted their test performance and they wanted to redo the assessment. Now, given we're technology companies, we actually monitor, every keystroke that is made. And I was able to very clearly show that, how that individual responded to that part of that specific assessment was no different to all the other assessments and there was no evidence of the internet dropping out. In that instance, we were comfortable that the results from the test were accurate, and those are the results that were going to be used going forward in the recruitment test. Probably the final point I'd add is the tests should just form one point or, one part of a wider decision-making process. So, companies who are making decisions will generally have multiple data points they take into consideration rather than just one in isolation. So people shouldn't worry too much about one specific test.
Just one final point before we talk a bit about the future of psychometrics is feedback. How important is it to give feedback to candidates in relation to their tests? If there's a lot of people, how do you do that?
Sure. I mean, ideally feedback, more broadly, feedback from the recruitment process should sort of mirror the investment made by the candidate. And so if they're doing, a quick 30-minute test at home, then that can be, a very email automated feedback versus if they have come into an interview, then you'd expect maybe, hopefully, sort of like telephone-based feedback. So that's sort of the general philosophy I've got. It's a bit of a funnel. Yes. So feedback, yes, candidates should be getting feedback. Lots of them don't. And the way it should be done, and if I think about my system, and I know some other systems do it as well, is there should be an automatically generated candidate feedback report that can be shared with candidates at the appropriate juncture, right? So you might find, what's an example? I've got live testing with a graduate company at the moment. They're testing hundreds of graduates, and testing is one of the first things they've done, but they then have assessment centers and final stage interviews and offers, and they might want to release all the feedback once they've made the offers. Right? They don't want, that feedback contaminating how a candidate might try and adjust their style in an interview, for example. So I think that's completely fine. Companies should have discretion over when in the recruitment cycle they're sharing this feedback, but they definitely should be sharing it. And with psychometrics, that's quite easy to do because you can automate it with feedback reports.
Okay, so what does the future hold for psychometrics, Justin? Where's the whole field going, do you think?
There's a couple of, I think, probably really fascinating developments. One is around gamified assessments. So this is where people are doing games generally, but not always on their mobile phone. And these games are trying to get markers of future potential or future performance and role. That field is very much still developing, and there's a huge spectrum, right, of quality of assessments are available there. I've done some work with a company based pretty locally to me in Brisbane, and they've really gone down a nice of scientific route where they've tried to build short games that tap into aspects of cognitive ability, and spent a lot of time and research showing that that's the case. So that's one end of a sort of a more rigorous approach. And on the other end, I think back to one game that was one of the earliest where, they had these, almost like a time management game where, a customer was coming in, and based on the customer's crude facial expressions, you had to match the meal of the day to optimize their mood, if you will. And that was meant to measure a whole raft of things, including, emotional intelligence, all these sorts of things. So I think the space where we're moving to, right, where we're using more novel ways to measure these established areas is really quite exciting. I think the science is still playing catch up for lots of some of the providers out there, but that's an exciting space about where things are going. And probably another one that's really exciting is around big data and how we sort of harvest things like our social media footprints. And I think a really interesting, potentially dark example of this was the Cambridge Analytica scandal that's been going on for a couple of years now. And basically what happened there is you had a company scrape, lots of, or get access to lots of Facebook data, because there's some really cool research done back in 2012 about you are what you like, which is people did a personality questionnaire, and then they gave permission for their Facebook likes to be collated. And then they looked at these different signatures, if you will, about, what people like and their interests on Facebook and how that links to, more stable and well-researched personality areas. So when we fast forward to that Cambridge Analytica scandal, we suddenly had very targeted Facebook advertising, say with the US elections, trying to dissuade voters that was based around their projected voting preferences. We had canvassers come and knock at people's doors. I think they had one of 32 personality type personas that they put people in based to these sort of social media profiles, and then had a tailored influencing script being used with these people. And then that same company, Cambridge Analytica, were claiming they had a very influential role in Brexit, once again shaping the voting preferences based on their insights from social media data. So for me, there's a very fascinating development where, I guess in ideal world, people own their digital footprints, the data they have on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and so forth, and they have some sort of control of that. So they choose to push that to their intended employer, or they choose to give that to, company X to get a discount on products. The more Orwellian future is that the big companies have that already and simply use that, right? Deciding who is talent and who is not. So I think those two areas, gamified assessments and how big data is utilized, fascinating developments in my space.
Wow, what a future we have. Okay, mate, it is now time for 5 questions that all chiefs answer. Okay, what is the number one book you'd recommend every middle executive read?
I'm going to be cheeky and actually go for 2, sort of segueing from what we've talked about. One, I was thinking if anything we've talked about, has resonated for listeners, what would be a good general sort of introduction for, hiring managers, so to get their head around this space. And that's a book by Nick Kinley called Talent Intelligence: What You Need to Know to Identify and Measure Talent. I think that was done back in about 2013. So I'm sure there's some secondhand copies you can pick up for $10 or something like that. That's a pretty good intro, actually, for talking about lots of things that we have on this. And the other one is one that I've actually recommended the most to leaders. And that's called Mind Over Mood: Change How You Feel by Changing the Way You Think by Dennis Greenberger. I recommend this a lot to people who have challenges with emotions, right, as a leader. And that might be having some questions around self-doubt. So that's sort of imposter syndrome. This might be questions of concern or worry about the future, and having the sort of impact that they want to have. And then also when frustration or disappointment plays too big a role in this leader's reputation, then I find that this book is incredibly practical. It's all about exercises and techniques to understand, maybe certain events or situations or people that might be triggers for you for these sorts of strong emotions, and then to put you in the driving seat for gaining control of these emotions so you can shape them more positively. So yeah, that's probably the most frequent book that I recommend in coaching developmental conversations, or leaking to feedback from assessments that I've delivered to people.
What is the next thing in life you're most excited about?
Well, I touched on some of the work we're doing now with fitting people to roles is super exciting, because that gives us opportunity to fit people to tens of thousands of roles. So that's super exciting. And then the other thing that's, a bit of nerdy pleasure that about is a spin-off business or a side hustle called Advantage Punter. And that's where we apply all these fancy stats and machine learning, all these sorts of things to predict sporting outcomes. So rugby union, rugby league, and some racing. We've had some great success. I think the time we're doing this, rugby union's about 38% return on investments this year. And last year we predicted the Melbourne Cup winner. So, there's some fun and profitable times through that.
That's really cool. So that's Advantage Punter. I'll make sure I put the link to that in the show notes as well. How do people connect with you, Justin? What's the best way?
They can use LinkedIn. So I'm on there, or they can find me through my website, which is peopleexcellence.co.uk.
Excellent. Right. I'm going to put all those in the show notes. I certainly highly recommend engaging Justin. I've used him from time to time in conjunction with other projects I've been working on, and an absolute pro. Now, listen, mate, can you nominate another chief you hold with great respect that you think should be on the podcast?
Certainly can. And her name is Kristen Podigal. So she is managing partner or, the head of McCulloch Robertson, a top tier law firm. And she is a very special individual, not only incredibly driven, I think she was maybe the youngest partner in Australia or something like that originally, but yes, so incredibly driven and committed as you would need to be to achieve those sort of accolades and status so early in life. But such a compassionate and empathetic and, it has a lot of interpersonal skill. So a very rare individual who's also, very humble. So could not recommend her more highly.
Oh, wow. Well, we look forward to getting Kristen on the show. Now, if you could lead any organisation in the world, can't be your own, which would it be?
Well, I wouldn't lead them, but I'd probably want something like a head of analytics at Apple. And the reason for that is, we've talked about psychometrics, which is generally what people, want to say about themselves, what they espouse about themselves. What I would love would be get hold of everyone's smartphones, right? So then, the stuff you can do with that is remarkable. For example, they did research, I think all the way back in 2012, where you could predict depression simply based on the geosensors in your phone. So basically how much you were traveling and when that natural sort of diameter, how much you normally get around, shrinks by a certain threshold, they can predict depression quite accurately. So for me, that combination of, lots of data and what you actually do would be heaven.
Yep. Wow, that sounds like a really interesting role. Okay, mate, the floor is now yours to wax lyrical. What is your final message of wisdom and hope you think is vital for the next generation of executives?
Forgive me for going a little bit deep here, but I'd probably say we're all the same, but slightly different. And the reason for that is, the sameness is, I think, particularly in the age of social media, we focus on superficial differences, right? We forget the fact that we are all just humans. We've had the same evolutionary history and we have, some very basic human needs. And I think that was really powerfully brought home by Jacinta Ardern, with the horrible stuff that happened in Christchurch earlier. I think what stood out for me is her power of a leader there was just to treat people fundamentally as humans, right? To show that fundamental compassion, human to human. So I think that's really powerful about that sameness. And then the point about the slightly different is, I think I touched upon this before, for leaders to flex their style and to actually to appreciate that we are not identical. So often leaders might get in the space where they assume that everyone else is a carbon copy of themselves, rather than acknowledge the fact that people have slight differences in how they might solve problems, what motivates them, what they're really striving towards, what they want to achieve in their world, in their lives. So I think just to acknowledge those subtle differences and to flex, to build the relationships we want to have with our direct reports, or to be more successful when we want to influence those people who are important to us in our lives. So we're all the same, but slightly different.
That's a magic way to finish. Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. You've been a great friend for many years, and thank you for your contribution.
My absolute pleasure, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, mate. Chiefs, that sums it up for this week. I encourage you to reach out to Justin and learn from him about how you can either ace a psychometric test or learn how to use them to predict who to promote in your team or select the right people. The science now is unbelievable, and he remains at the cutting edge. All the show notes can be found at chiefmaker.com/380. And if you would like to stay in touch and hear all about some of the best resources you can find anywhere in the world to improve your performance at work, go to chiefmaker.com/subscribe. Now, Chief, if you're yet to rate the episode and subscribe, I hope you'll do so soon. It helps others see the magnificent value that the Chiefs and Gurus bring to their life and career. So make sure you hit subscribe on your podcast app now, give it a 5-star rating if you think it's worthy, and leave a short review about your favourite episode. Righto, Chiefs, as always, remember to stay epic.